Hello, this is the first video in my macroeconomics series for Economics A2 level Unit 4 with AQA. It's about economic growth in the economic cycle, and you'll probably be quite familiar with some of the stuff from AS level. But it's got a few basics and goes into slightly more detail on some areas. Here is some basic terminology about economic cycles. An economic cycle is the cyclical pattern of short-term fluctuations in GDP. You'll probably recognise the diagram when you see it. It's right at the end of this video actually. It's the one where it sort of waves up and down, and that's the economic cycle, also known as the business cycle. Economic growth is a rise in real output of the economy. It's often accompanied by a rise in real living standards. There's two ways of measuring economic growth in terms of the growth rate. There's the long-term growth rate, which is the average rate of growth sustained over a period of time. So it's measured using real GDP, which is output divided by the population, taking inflation into account. That might be measured per year. And then we've got the trend growth rate, which is the long run average increase in GDP. So obviously within the economic cycle you've got times when GDP is rising, sometimes it might be falling. So the trend growth rate takes into account the rises and the falls and gives you a sort of average over the economic cycle. A recession occurs when GDP is falling, so it's essentially negative economic growth, and the official definition is when it's over 2 successive quarters, so for half a year or more, and GDP is falling, that's a recession. Sometimes something serious might happen and you might have a double dip recession. In a double dip recession, you essentially go into a recession, you come out of recession, then you go back into it again relatively soon after. Output gaps. They're measured by doing the actual level of GDP minus the productive potential of the economy. So say we had a small island, it's got 3 people on. If these 3 people work for a suitable number of hours a day, they can make 20 chocolate bars between them. If they're producing 30 chocolate bars between them, that's a positive output gap because they're producing above their sort of potential, above their suitable level of output, possibly because they're working for longer hours than they should be working in order to keep healthy. So essentially, if you're overworking your factors of production, you can produce above the sort of suitable level of output. So on the productive potential curve, we've got B, that's the sort of suitable level of output. C, you're overworking things, so that's not a sustainable place to be producing in the long run. A negative output gap would occur if, say, we only have 10 chocolate bars being produced by these people on the island, so you'll be producing at A inside the productive potential curve. So you're not producing at your potential level of output, and that's leading to wasted resources. So say one of the people is lazy and they don't want to make more chocolate, or maybe they just don't like chocolate, maybe they've got an allergy. For some reason they're not making chocolate when they could be making chocolate, so you're producing below your potential and you've got a negative output gap. Obviously if we extend this idea of the island to the whole of the UK, it makes a lot more sense, and you can see that we can have a lot of wasted resources if we've got unemployment and stuff like that. This is one reason why a shortage of demand can be quite dangerous. So say we've got our people on our island again, they're making their chocolate. They could be making 20 bars a day, but if there's no one that wants to eat the chocolate, there's no demand for the chocolate, and they've got absolutely nothing else they can do, we're wasting all those resources. We're sort of not reaching our potential as an economy simply because there's no demand for the things we are producing, and that will lead to cyclical unemployment. When it comes to economic growth, there's essentially 2 types. There's potential growth and real growth. Potential growth is moving from what you are producing to moving to what you are actually able to produce as an economy. So say our island was making 10 chocolate bars and they had the ability to make 20, then they go up to making 20 chocolate bars. That's potential growth. They're moving from A to B, so they're moving on to their potential production boundary or whatever it's called. This simply means that they're reaching their capacity rather than expanding it. If they're expanding their capacity, that's real growth. So say they made investment into new technology and stuff like that, that would lead to an increase in the ability of the country to produce, they'd be able to produce more, and so the PPB would shift outwards from PPB1 to PPB2. If we're looking at the role of demand in this, moving from A to B, if there's an increase in demand, people might be more willing to produce things. So we might have got some factories that are able to produce, but when there's no demand, they're not going to produce anything. Whereas if we suddenly have a rise in demand, then these factories are going to start producing. They're going to be like, woo, let's make some bananas, or whatever these factories are producing. I don't think bananas are made in factories, but that's irrelevant. So they start producing, and that leads to potential growth. Whereas with real growth, so from B onto the blue curve, we would have to have an increase in demand matching the increase in capacity in order for this rise in productive capacity to be worthwhile or to have any impact. Because, say, our island suddenly has the capacity to produce another 10 bars of chocolate, there's no point in having this increase in capacity unless there is an increase in demand for chocolate, because otherwise they're simply not going to make the extra chocolate, and so we have the capacity there, but we're not going to use it. There are lots of reasons we might have more economic growth: economic stability, increased labour participation, increased labour productivity, and enterprise. I'm really sorry if my voice is more annoying than usual today. I've got a bit of a cold, so it's sort of bleh. In times of economic stability, so say we've got relatively low inflation rate, relatively high employment levels, that sort of thing, businesses start to get more confident. They're like, ooh, this demand is still going to be here tomorrow. I don't know why they're Italian. And so they start producing more, they've got more confidence, and so they start investing. So say there's economic stability and our factory is producing bananas, they might think, look, everyone's stable, the demand for bananas, say the luxury bananas, is still going to be there tomorrow, so we're going to invest in more machines to produce more bananas. It's so stupid because bananas aren't produced by machines. Yeah, so essentially if we've got stability, people are more confident, so they invest more. This is one reason why so many government policies are essentially directed at ensuring stability within the economy and keeping inflation low, because if inflation gets high, people become uncertain that their savings are going to sort of lose value and that sort of thing, and they stop spending, and that leads to a fall in demand. So businesses go, they lose confidence and they stop investing, which leads to a reduction in economic growth, because there's no new machines, so we're not going to have any rise in capacity, and old machines might start to break down or die or something like that, and so then we actually might lose capacity if we don't have a sufficient level of investment. Moving on to increased labour participation. Labour participation is essentially the proportion of the population of working age in a job or actively seeking work. So if we've got lots of the population in jobs, so we've got a high labour participation rate, that's going to be good. We're going to have more growth, because if there's more people in work, then we're using more of our potential, we're maximising our output. So say on our island we went from having 2 of our people producing chocolate to 3 of our people producing chocolate. Obviously output is going to increase, so we're going to have some economic growth there. That's likely to be potential economic growth, because these people were capable before, they simply didn't want to work or didn't work for some other reason. There's lots of ways that a government or a country or whatever can increase labour participation. So if we relax attitudes to women working, so we say, you know what, don't stay at home, don't be a housewife or whatever, come into work and help to contribute to the economy, then we're more likely to see a growth in GDP. Although it is important to take into account that housewives and house husbands do contribute to the economy in the non-monetised sector, which we're going to come on to in a bit. So although we're not seeing that they're contributing to GDP, when they're at home doing work and cleaning around the house, cooking, doing whatever, they are still contributing to the economy. Whilst on the topic of parents, having flexible working practices, so people able to work part-time and that sort of thing, also leads to increased labour participation, because there might be someone that has a child that doesn't want to work full-time because they want to spend some time with their child, but they want to still do some work. If we don't have this ability to do part-time work, they're probably going to stay at home and not work at all. Whereas if we've got a part-time thing, they can go into work a bit, they'll contribute to the economy, they'll help with some level of growth, but they still get to do spending time at home with baby. If we have incentives in the tax system, so low levels of income tax, and a tougher benefit system, so lower levels of welfare payments, that's going to be an encouraging thing as an incentive for people to go out and work, so that's going to increase the labour participation rate. Also, just providing retraining to overcome occupational immobility is going to get people into work. So say when the mines closed, we trained everybody to be accountants or nurses, or to fill in all these gaps. People will go from being miners to going into other areas of work, rather than going from miners to unemployment, which would lead to a fall in the labour participation rate, and thus we really would not be reaching our maximum potential, our proper capacity, so we wouldn't be having that level of growth. Increased labour productivity will obviously lead to economic growth, because we're using the same resources to produce more, and the big one for this is when we're improving human capital, which is education and training. That's the big thing. Whenever anyone mentions economic growth. How can a country get economic growth? Supply side policy, education and training. Basic example of this, we've got Bob. Bob is an accountant, or I don't know what he's doing, he's a secretary, and he is typing. He hasn't been trained how to type, so he's typing one finger at a time. This takes quite a long time. If we just give Bob a few days of training, he can become a touch typer. He'll work so much faster, his productivity will go through the roof. And I can't even pronounce today. Roof. And productivity within the economy is increasing if we have this across the whole economy. So more growth. General investment for firms can also be encouraged if we have lower taxes on profit. Tax relief for high spending on research and development. If we promote business university links, so this is more research stuff, if we can get businesses to be close with the people that are doing the researchers can research into what the businesses want, and it will help the businesses more to increase their capacity as a business and thus increase the capacity of the economy as a whole. If we reform trade union legislation and have privatisation, those two are both a bit controversial, but they can lead to increases in productivity for the economy. So say privatisation, things tend to be more productive, and because you're driven by profits essentially in the private sector. So if we move things from the public sector to the private sector, which is privatisation, happened with Royal Mail I believe, then essentially we have more efficiency leads to more growth. If we have tougher competition policy, so we don't allow monopolies which tend to be ineffective, that leads to growth. If we encourage foreign direct investment and stability, that also leads to growth. Final one is enterprise. If we have a culture of enterprise, it encourages growth. If we get people to be innovative, if they're coming up with new designs for ways of producing things, new products, this can all stimulate growth within the economy. I would go into more detail on these things, but I think we covered them so much at AS level, I don't want to go over it all over again, because you can probably remember it. Economic growth, good or bad? Probably good overall, but important evaluation to make. Advantages of economic growth, it leads to a rise in material living standards. If we're producing more, there are more goods and services out there for consumers to be able to buy. If we're producing more, it leads to a rise in supply, which tends to lead in fall in prices as well, so people can buy more with their money. However, it's important to say, look, you've got more stuff, but does this necessarily mean you're happy? Say we've got Clarissa. Clarissa's just gone and bought a new handbag. Is Clarissa happy? Maybe, but is it due to the handbag? Probably not. There is only so much happiness a handbag can give you. And you can actually get to a state where people are so materialistic, happiness actually decreases. That said, a rise in material living standards can lead to a reduction in poverty, so people right at the bottom, in terms of income, benefit massively from economic growth, or they can benefit massively. It's important to take into account that benefits of economic growth are unlikely to be spread evenly, so people right at the top tend to make a lot more than people right at the bottom. But because they're making more, they have to pay more tax, so the government takes this tax and it can give it to the poorest in welfare payments and stuff like that. So you tend to get a reduction in poverty. So countries that are having high economic growth and have got lots and lots of growth within the economy tend to have better living standards for all people than those who don't have very much growth at all. And that just goes hand in hand with the increased tax revenue. But leave that, people are doing better, people are being taxed more, government can not only reduce poverty, but it can also spend this money on roads, education, which can lead to even more growth in the future. However, we can also look at a few other disadvantages we haven't covered yet. Negative externalities often come hand in hand with growth. We've got more factories producing stuff, and these factories also, sadly, pushing out smoke, killing the environment one day at a time. Dun dun dun. Also, if we look at the bottom point there, it's a really interesting one actually, I quite like it. If we've got an economy which is on its productive potential boundary, it can only grow if it moves along the boundary in the short term to produce more capital goods. If it's producing more capital goods in order to get future growth, in the short term it's producing less consumer goods. So materialistic welfare in the economy can actually drop in the short term. Sad times for Clarissa. My aunt had a hen called Clarissa, and then it got eaten. Now we're going to look at the measurement of national income. National income is GNP minus the depreciation of capital equipment. So this happens when equipment and machinery stops working so well. GNP is gross national product. Gross national product is GDP plus net property income from abroad. Net property income from abroad is essentially all of the income we're getting into the country in profits, interest, that sort of thing. Take away all the stuff which is going out. GDP is gross domestic product, something you're probably very, very familiar with, and it is output produced by the resources within the UK. It's the stuff that our factors of production are making. However, there are lots of issues with using GDP as a measure of living standard. First and foremost, it is incomplete. As we've said before, it excludes the non-monetised sector, so this is anyone that's working but not getting paid for the work they're doing, even if it is contributing to the economy. So anyone that's volunteering, anyone that's working as a housewife, house husband, this is stuff they could be paid for and it's contributing to the economy, but it's not included in the economy because it isn't part of income and stuff like that. Also, GDP doesn't take into account what is being produced, so it's great if we're producing loads of handbags, but are these really providing us with that much happiness? Is it really increasing our living standards that much? No. Whereas if we were making, more phones, that could be contributing a lot to our living standards. We can organise meeting up with friends, that sort of thing. Although obviously phones are controversial again because people think that we're becoming obsessed with them. GDP may not actually reflect the rise in the quality of goods and services. So say we're still selling stuff at the same price, but the quality's increased, we're not going to be able to see this within GDP because GDP doesn't take into account the quality of the goods and services. So we've got our iPod 4, maybe it's the same price as the iPod 1 was all those years ago, but it's so much better. I don't know how that's going to lead to an increase in our living standard that much. Yay, we can take selfies now, but essentially it could do. So we need to take this sort of thing into account when we're using GDP to measure living standards, but we can't do it. Obviously, income distribution isn't going to be equal, so yay, we're making loads more money. GDP is rising, but equality might not be rising. As we've said before, rising growth tends to benefit those at the top a lot more than those at the bottom. Also doesn't account for leisure time, GDP, so it's great that we're producing more, output is through the roof, but everyone's working so much more. Say we've got this great positive output gap, but that's only because we're forcing people to work for longer and longer hours. People haven't got any leisure time anymore, so their standard of living is actually decreased because they haven't got any time to relax, spend time with their families, their kids, their dogs, cats. Cats are so much better than dogs, that sort of thing. And finally, negative externalities. The great drive for economic growth tends to lead to people taking more risks with the environment, forcing out more smoke into the thing, chopping down more trees, that sort of thing. Also, we've got loads of congestion on the roads because everyone's rushing about in their lorries. Dante is sat at the back, he just wants to go to the park to spend time with his kids, but he can't because he's stuck in a traffic jam. And so his living standard has decreased because who wants to be stuck in a car with whiny kids? Also, because we have our GDPs in their original currencies, they need to be all put into one currency in order to be able to compare them across the whole world. So we have to use purchasing power parity, which is essentially the exchange rates which take into account the cost of a basket of goods in one country compared to another. Can we take a moment to appreciate my basket of goods? They tend to contain a lot of other things like petrol, food, books, anything that the typical family buys. There's actually a really interesting photo that I saw the other day on Tumblr, which is how much things cost then compared to how much things cost now, and it is crazy how much prices have changed. But that's not really what we're looking at because we're looking at exchange rates here, but I thought that was an interesting point to make. That's to do with inflation, which we'll come on to in another video. But essentially, PPP allows us to compare what currency within a country is able to buy. So it essentially looks at the purchasing power of a currency. I don't really see why this would come up in the exam. I think it's just an interesting thing to know. Let's look at some alternative measures of economic welfare. I'm going to try to whiz through these quite quickly. We've got the Human Development Index, HDI, takes into account standard of living, life expectancy and educational attainment, which is the adult literary rate and the enrolment ratio, so the number of people that are going to college, going to university, that sort of thing. HPI is the Human Poverty Index, looks at longevity, so how long people are living, knowledge, economic provisioning and social inclusion. So is everyone getting involved? Is the government giving people the stuff they need? We have the MDP, the Measure of Domestic Progress, which looks at progress in the quality of life and progress towards a sustainable environment. This also takes in some stuff that the GDP didn't take into account, so the social and economic costs of growth. So it's great, we've got loads of more handbags, but we've also got a dead environment, a dead tree and a dead squirrel in the garden. It also takes into account the benefits of unpaid work, so our housewives, our house husbands, our volunteers, that sort of thing. Finally, the misery index, sad times, takes into account the unemployment rate and adds to it the inflation rate. So that's the social and economic cost to the economy of growth. It essentially makes the assumption that we've got lots of unemployed people and lots of inflation. People are going to be feeling pretty miserable. People aren't going to be having that good of a time economically because they're unemployed and prices are shooting sky high. And we all know that when there's unemployment and rising prices, it isn't too good because benefits don't always keep in line with inflation. The minimum wage doesn't always rise in line with inflation. So people start to see the purchasing power of their incomes falling, and it's just a bit miserable, hence misery index. It's important to consider whether economic growth is sustainable. Sustainable economic growth is growth that doesn't impose costs on future generations. So we don't use up all the oil, we don't use up all the coal. So future generations are also able to enjoy the same level of economic growth that we've had. We can encourage this through regulation, particularly in the limiting of negative externalities and that sort of thing. However, sustainable economic growth is threatened by the exhaustion of resources. So we're using up more and more oil. Future generations, they ain't going to have that oil. They're not going to be able to produce the same stuff that we have. But, also important to take into account is the market mechanism. As supply starts to fall, we have this left shift of the supply curve, the price will start to go up and up and up. So hopefully we'll start not using it as much and we'll look for other sources of energy, that sort of thing. So future generations will be able to get their energy from another source. Fracking, for example, controversial one there. Environmental damage, we've got our emissions, we've got our wastage, so we're, using up all these things, we're burning all this stuff. I'm not very technical today. If we're destroying the environment, what kind of environment will future generations have to live in? So, our economic growth is great for us, but in the future they're going to live in a world filled with smog. They're not going to be able to breathe properly. They might have to wear those masks that they sometimes wear when people are ill. I've seen those masks, I always really wanted one. Global warming is another one. Things are getting hotter, so the ice is starting to melt, we're starting to get lots of flooding. How long until there is no land left? I really want to know this, so if anyone knows the answer, can you comment it below? Cheers! I never ask for comments or stuff, but this is just something I'm quite interested in and can't be bothered to look up, even though it'll probably take 5 minutes. Here is that graph I promised you right at the start of the video. It's a bit embarrassing, that font. I thought I was really cool using triangles in my font. I don't know what the font is, but I thought it was really indie at the time I made it. I think I made that at GCSE or AS level or something, so you probably recognised it from another video. But yeah, that is essentially what the economic cycle looks like. So we have our recovery right at the start, which is when we've got rising confidence, we've got optimism about the future. So we've got a rise in AD and a multiplier. So this is the bit where it's sort of coming up towards the red line and it's about to cross the red line. So this is after the negative output gap. So people are starting to feel more optimistic. So if AD is rising, then people are going to be spending more, companies are going to be investing more, people will start to be feeling good and hopefully output will rise. In our boom, which is the bit where the curve is going right up and over, that's when we have a period of low unemployment and high economic growth. Everyone's feeling really happy, confident, woohoo! Until demand rises above potential output. Dun dun dun. So people are feeling so confident, they're demanding so much, we simply can't keep up. So demand is rising faster than supply, and we know that when that happens, this leads to a rise in prices. Inflation. Dun 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 dun. Our inflation is high, so our exports are quite expensive, so other countries are going to be not buying them so much. So we've got issues with the balance of payment there in terms of getting a bigger deficit. Also, we're demanding so much, we're importing loads and loads of stuff, which leads to more balance of payment deficit problems. Dun, 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 dun. We're starting to come into our downturn. Doo, 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 doo. High inflation, leading to reduced international competitiveness, which we've just talked about, leads to the government introducing contractionary policies. So they're trying to reduce demand for imports and that sort of thing, trying to lower inflation. So this usually leads to a fall in economic growth and a fall in employment. So if we're reducing demand, then firms within the UK, domestic firms, are going to be producing less, so they're going to start to I mean, A, that contributes to a fall in economic growth. Also, they're producing less, they don't need as many people working. So, alas, Bobby and Zelda have been made unemployed. I don't know why Bobby and Zelda, just Bobby and Zelda. They're unemployed. So, we've got this sort of period of, oh dear, this isn't very good, leading into the recession, which is when we've got this acceleration in unemployment. Tax revenues are falling, so we've got a budget deficit here. Which is actually okay if we've got a budget deficit, because it means that the government's starting to work their expansionary policies because we're trying to come out of the recession. Also, if we have this really long recession going on and on and on, we also call it a depression or a slump, and this leads to quite unfortunate times. People try to employ different methods, like you might try austerity or autarky, which is when one country is producing all their goods and services themselves and not importing much at all. And if all countries are doing this, this leads to a fall in output across the whole world, because people aren't benefiting from comparative advantage and stuff like that, which is sad, really sad. And it's also not very good for everybody, so everyone's living standards start falling, and it's really not fun. So we've got to be really careful to ensure that recessions don't spread worldwide. There's that famous quote, when America catches a cold, the whole world... No, when America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. Or as my old teacher said, the whole world catches pneumonia. Which is why it can be quite unfortunate to have globalisation, because it leads to more interdependence and recessions can spread more. So we can have whole world downturns, which are really not good times. So why do we have economic cycles? There's lots of reasons here in a beautiful rainbow. One of them is speculative bubbles. This is something that Schiller looks at in a lot of detail. So Robert Schiller, if anyone's interested, look him up, behavioural economist, which is a really cool guy. I really like him. Not that I know him personally. Speculative bubbles. Essentially, we have rapid economic growth, so it leads to a rise in asset prices. Big one here is houses. House prices start rising, so everyone starts buying them. And then when we have this sort of peak in asset prices, they've reached this maximum height, and everyone thinks, oh my god, I really want to sell now, I'm going to make a massive profit. Everyone tries to sell at once, so imagine that supply is suddenly bursting, so everyone's selling their houses, and if supply rises massively, we have a massive fall in prices, so there's a collapse in asset prices, a fall in confidence, and then this leads in turn to a downturn. I think bubbles are really interesting, though I'm not quite sure they can be credited with the whole economic cycle. I think there must be more stuff involved, otherwise prices would just rise and rise and rise. But I think they're really interesting. Number 2, changes in inventories. Inventory investment is essentially when people are holding raw materials and finished goods. Abdul owns a pen company. Abdul has 100 pens in storage because he thinks demand's going to be there in the future. Abdul hires Tom. Tom produces 2 pens a day. Demand then falls to 1 pen per day. Abdul fires Tom because Abdul's already got 100 pens in storage and he doesn't need Tom to keep producing pens if demand isn't going to be there. So that essentially leads, if we have this in a bigger scale, leads to unemployment throughout the economy, and that's the exacerbation of recessions. Dun, 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 dun. Political cycles. So the party in power, they're about to have an election, so it's this big general election coming up. The party in power is going to want to look good, so they're going to try to get a boom before the election. They're going to have people going, wow, look what they've done for the economy. So right before a general election, you tend to see a rise in economic output and economic conditions, which is what the political party is trying to manufacture in order to look popular. And then after you have the election, you tend to have deflationary policies and sort of goes downhill a bit, the output does. Definitely something for people to be looking out for with the general election coming up. I am so excited and so annoyed that I'm like 3 weeks too late to vote. If only I had been born a month earlier. Outside shocks, I think these are really interesting. So we say we have a demand side shock, so demand suddenly falls, maybe because a disease has killed half of the earth. We're going to have to reduce our output and we're going to have sort of a slowdown in economic growth. Or say maybe we have a massive increase in the birth rate, then demand is going to go right up for baby products, and that could lead to growth within the economy. So essentially we have this sort of cycle of demand rising and falling, but due to sudden shocks. So shocks, things happen suddenly. So on the supply side, for example, a sudden fall in the supply of oil or a sudden rise in the supply of oil. Maybe there's an explosion or something. Also striking. If we have lots of workers on strike, then supply will suddenly fall. And all this messing about with output can have serious consequences for an economy's GDP if they happen over a prolonged period of time. If the impact of the shock is felt for more than a very short period of time, it can have an impact on the whole economy for quite a while. Finally, the accelerator and the multiplier effect, these things that we've come back to about 50,000 times. The accelerator effect happens when rising national income leads to investment into a multiplier, so we see this when we've got our sort of economic growth in our upturns. The multiplier effect, a change in a component of aggregate demand, leads to a greater change in overall income, so a rise in demand leads to a rise in income for everybody, because more demand, so more people are going to need to be employed, so more demand for workers, wages get put up, that sort of thing. However, it does work in both directions, so a fall in demand leads to a rise in unemployment. So that's an interesting one. I quite like it, and it's always great to quote it because it's snazzy. Woo! I'm exhausted. You're probably exhausted from listening to my voice for that long if you've made it this far. But that is the end of the video on the economic cycle and economic growth and all that fun stuff. See you next time for a video on inflation and deflation, and have a lovely day and lovely evening, lovely life. Woo! See ya! Bye!